Quilting Celebrations with Patrick Lose is brought to you by The Warm Company, manufacturers of the most loved battings and double-stick fusibles for creative people. Janome, what's next? Superior Threads, all your favorite threads. Havel's Sewing, cut it close with Havel's Sewing. And Patrick Lose Studios, designs and inspirations for your quilting celebrations.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Quilting Celebrations with Patrick Lose. I'm Patrick, and I've asked my friend Kay Capps-Cross to be with me here again for this episode that we're going to do on binding quilts. Kay, you said that you needed a refresher course anyway.
I do.
So what are the things that you think you need to work on with your binding?
The end, in particular. Joining the two.
Joining the beginning and the end. Okay, well, we're going to do that in this episode too, so I can show you that. But
and I'm curious how you do your corners too, to see if I'm doing it the easiest way. You know,
that's one of the things that I do feel like I can teach a little bit. I always say that I'm not known as a technique quilter. I'm not, you know, I have very few techniques that I've developed on my own and that I teach and that I feel very confident about teaching, and one of them is the way that I do binding corners.
You're a finesse quilter though. I mean, the things that you teach, you do
picky.
Very, very well.
Yeah, I'm a little picky. But the thing about my binding corners that excited me was that I noticed that I was getting a better binding corner when I was doing mitered corners on straight binding. But when I was out teaching it in classes, I mean, I had students actually, you know, that aha moment when they would do that corner and figure out what it was going to do for their quilt. And they, at one point, one student screamed out, "Oh my God, now I can enter my quilts in the Iowa State Fair," because, you know, her corners were always the bane of her existence.
Yeah.
You know, she wanted to know how to do corners.
Isn't that the best thing about teaching?
It is.
Those light bulbs?
Very
incredible.
rewarding.
Yeah.
Well, you know, that's one of the things that I can show here in, you know, I've got a collection of some pieces here I can show you bindings on. And these binding corners are the things that really I am very picky about. And, you know, I want to be able to, I had the privilege of judging quilts at the Iowa State Fair's competition. And there were over 700 quilts.
That had to be challenging and very fun.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. And, you know, there were three of us. We couldn't, you know, one person judge that many quilts. But I like to be able to just, as the quilt's laying on the table, be able to go along the binding and feel along that binding, make sure that it's completely full, and then when I get to a corner, it's not any thicker or lumpier than the rest of the binding, because that shows that the corner's been mitered well and that it's interlocking. You know, it just makes it a lot smoother.
And so you as a judge were really looking at those type of things?
Honestly, one of the quilts, one of the categories, it came down to the binding on the quilt because they were both excellent quilts, and for me it was one over the other with the way the binding was sewn on.
Now you know why I do not enter quilts in competitions.
Well, I don't either. I don't either. But you know, here's some of the square bindings that I've done. And
this one is interesting. This is adorable.
Thank you.
Now, how did you get the snowflakes?
This is actually machine embroidery. So this piece was all done in the hoop with machine embroidery.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So some of them, like this one, I believe is, you know, hand stitched or, you know, fusible applique, doing it by hand on a domestic machine. But some of them are done by machine embroidery, and that's really cool too.
That is really cool. That's something I just have never
You could do this by hand though. You could do a what I call scribble stitching and stitch those snowflakes just by darning in a circle. It'd be really easy.
Throw
or
a couple
sew buttons on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, throw some buttons on there.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned straight grain binding. When I first started quilting, I was told never do straight grain binding. You don't want to do it. You can only do bias binding to get a good look.
I would never do bias binding. I mean, I guess people have their different reasons for doing things, and I don't want to, you know, discount one person's reasoning over another, but I don't understand why anyone would do bias binding.
I don't either. That was one of the first things that I discovered. Oh, I don't have to follow the rules.
When you get to that corner, if your fabric is cut on the bias, it's going to want to ripple at that corner. It's not going to want to lay nicely and fold along those threads and make a perfect folded corner. So I wouldn't do it personally.
Straight grain bindings are awesome.
But bias bindings, it's needed for a piece like this. You have to cut your binding on the bias to be able to bind a curved piece like this, especially one with multiple curves. You know, and I've got a lot of examples of those too. These smaller pieces, coasters, you know, this actually is a lot easier. People say, oh, I couldn't do that. That's too small and too tight. But it's really very easy to do. And, you know, if you use a good bias cut binding, you'll get the curves perfectly.
Fabric is amazing. How it is forgiving.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Now, I love all the shapes you do. This is one thing I love about your work.
Well, I don't like to be confined to a space. You know, if I design something and I think it's going to work better on a curve or a straight, Sometimes it's fun to jump out of that box, you know, and have a curve like this one. You know, it would have been very easy to do that just as a circle, but I just thought it was fun to bring the hat up and take it out of that circle.
Much more interesting.
And,
Yeah.
And it can be done if you do your bindings the right way.
Now, I think you and I are in agreement on something. Am I invited to the back of your quilts?
Sure. We can take a look. I don't always care about what the back looks like. You know,
I don't either.
I feel like if people are turning your quilts over or your table toppers or whatever it is and looking at the back, I don't need to invite them over anymore for dinner.
Exactly.
You know?
That's one thing that I have my students write this down verbatim. I do not recall inviting you to the back of my quilt.
I can get that. Competition quilts might be a little bit different.
That would be a whole different story.
But we're not making heirlooms here. These are fusible applique. They're fun quilts, celebratory kind of pieces.
And it's the process, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a whole process. So you can show that if you want to. I know you are.
I want to because there's something really cool about it too. This bias, you know, we think it's tricky, and you mentioned that people think this is too small to do. This is actually so easy, isn't it?
It's very easy, yeah.
Because you press it, and you've got it ready.
Because it's cut on the bias, when you turn it to the backside, it just conforms to the shape of the circle. And in this case, we haven't even sewn this down by hand yet. You can see that the shape is
exactly in place.
Yeah. So it makes it a lot easier because then when you do go to sew it down, there's no pins or
Yeah, and you and I love
necessary.
no pins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The easier, the better. So what I'm going to be able to do in this episode is teach an economical way to cut this binding, because a lot of people think that you need to take a yard of fabric or a yard of goods, whatever, from selvage to selvage and cut binding strips, which can be very wasteful.
That would be.
And it's completely unnecessary. I can do this size. This is an 8-inch mat, and out of a 15-inch square of fabric, I can get enough bias binding cut to make 2 of these, to bind 2 of them.
Wow.
So it's very economical, and we'll show that later on in the episode.
I'm going to just slide my finger around here,
Okay.
just to see. Where is the beginning and the end?
Don't be judging me.
I don't know where it is.
Oh, really? You mean as far as the starting and
Yeah.
stopping point? Well,
Good
we don't want
job.
to see the back of that one. Good. Well, there it is. I felt it, but
A+.
that's all right. Thank you.
Oh, well, I did too a little, but how can you not feel it a little?
Yeah, and it's not about there's going to be a seam. One way or the other, you've got to have a seam. It's about making the seam not bulky, and that's what we will concentrate
And this,
on.
if you just look at this, you're never going to see it.
Right.
Never.
And here's a couple of others. This one, you'd be tempted to use straight because there are 2 right angle corners, but it has a curved top, and so you have to have a curved bias cut binding for that.
Now you could do something I do sometimes. I like to go to my binding box and I have all these ends and pieces.
Yeah.
So I might actually on that piece use straight grain on the bottom, hook
And
it to a different piece of bias on the top.
Yeah, I like multicolored bindings too. They're great. This one's just a straight circle. But this one, here's another one, a more complicated curve shape, and you have to have bias cut binding for a scalloped edge.
You would have to, yeah. Nice job on that.
But what we're going to do first in the next segment is we will work on doing straight grain binding. And I've got some tips for doing that, and then we'll work on those corners, and I'll show you how to get perfect, lump-free, smooth binding corners.
You guarantee?
I guarantee it.
You heard it here.
On the next segment.
Quilting Celebrations with Patrick Lose is brought to you by The Warm Company, manufacturers of the most loved battings and double-stick fusibles for creative people. Janome, what's next? Superior Threads, all your favorite threads. Havel Sewing, cut it close with Havel Sewing. And Patrick Lose Studios, designs and inspirations for your quilting celebrations.